Thank you. Thank you so much indeed for that very, very kind introduction. Thank you to the Rafael del Pino Foundation for inviting me and putting on this lecture today. Thank you to Galaxia Gutenberg for publishing the book. And thank you to the translator. I'm English. I was educated in England, so my command of Spanish is precisely 0. But I'm told that the translation is extremely elegant, extremely well done, and makes what we thought was funny even funnier. So thank you. I would say that the West at the moment is currently gripped by a mood of what I would call discordant apathy. The discord can be seen or heard everywhere. You can see it in the recent Greek elections, in the short, tortuous, and difficult career of Syriza. You can see it in the Republican election contest, where the front runner is a protest candidate who is a self-described buffoon, who likes to go around insulting his fellow candidates, who likes to go around insulting, even worse, journalists, and makes ridiculous boasts, for example, about building a wall to keep the Mexicans out and then making the Mexicans pay for the wall. That's the leading candidate. You can see this mood of discord also in the recent election of, in the recent election in the Labour Party in Britain of a hard-line leftist Trotskyite who'd been a backbencher, who'd voted against his own party more than any other member of his party, who really hadn't had an idea since the 1970s, and who suddenly is plucked from nowhere to become leader of the Labour Party. Voters really are furious. They're furious at the state of the world, they're furious with politicians, and they want something to be done about things. The US Congress regularly scores an approval rating of about 10%, which is roughly equivalent to the number of people in the country who are committed to lunatic asylums. In Britain, membership of the Tory party, the governing Tory party, has gone from about 3 million people in the 1950s to about 130,000 people today. Now, if you saw a company that had gone from 3 million customers to 130,000 customers, it would go to receivership, it would go out of business. But instead, the Tory party comes back and wins yet another election. So you have an extraordinary failure on the part of our political elites, but at the same time, you have, I think, a mood of intellectual apathy. You have a sort of sense that nobody is really thinking hard about how to redesign government. You have this notion that government is useless, we don't like it, it doesn't work, but we're not going to do any intellectual lifting, heavy lifting. We're not going to really think about how to change it and how to make it better. So you have Syriza, which makes all this terrible fuss about austerity, which protests against the consensus in Europe to have a more austere future, and then is re-elected in order to implement an even more austere program than the one it voted against in the first place. You have somebody like Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, who dreams really of going back to the 1970s in Britain, who dreams of a world where British Rail was run by the state, where 1 in 3 workers was employed by the state, who wants to bring back coal mining, but also thinks that coal as a fuel should be abolished. So you dig the coal up and then throw it away. And these problems, these people really aren't thinking about government, what it's for, or what you should do about it. But there are even those people who do think, even those people who do the genuinely difficult intellectual work of thinking about how we should reinvent the state, will tend to say, well, we need to change it. We absolutely understand that it can't go on as it is. But they will say with the Jean-Claude Juncker, you remember his famous phrase, all of us know what we need to do, we just don't know how to get elected if we do it. So on the one hand, you have people who are indulging in gesture politics, who are saying, let's bring back the coal mines, let's bring back nationalized railways. On the other hand, you have people who are more intelligent than that, but just say, we don't know how to reinvent the state because people won't buy it. I think there is a general sense of despair, a general sense that nothing can be done, a general sense that we're just stuck with the world as it is, and I think that's profoundly wrong and profoundly depressing. It's wrong and depressing for 3 reasons. The first is that the condition of the state of the state, matters enormously for reasons of competitiveness, of economic competitiveness. There are those on the right who say that the state doesn't matter. It's an irrelevancy. We should shrink it so it's the size of a baby that we can drown in the bathtub, as one American neoconservative has put it. That's a terrible set of ideas, because I think the state is absolutely important to our competitiveness. That, if you look at countries like Norway, look at companies like Denmark, look at companies like the United States, they have big, powerful states which are also valuable to their economic competitiveness. So the state matters. You'd much rather have a big state like Sweden than a small state like the Ivory Coast or something like that. State matters as competitiveness. The second is that the state can change. The state is a dynamic entity which changes over time. Everything we know about the forces of the economy tell us that we're seeing extraordinary structural changes going on in the economy at the moment. Companies being ripped apart, reconfigured, changed by the process of digital innovation, new technology. It would be extraordinary if the state didn't have to change very dramatically in the light of those changes. Secondly, everything we know about history tells us that the state has been invented and constantly reinvented in the light of new technologies, new ideas, new changes. And I think what we argue in this book is that one of the many reasons why the West pulled ahead of the rest of the world was precisely because the West managed to invent and then reinvent the state. The West had many advantages. It had freedom of thought, it has the company, it had economic innovation, but it also had a government that worked and could deal with the demands of the people, could deal with the demands of law and order, and so became a creative part of the economy. Which brings me to the third reason why the state matters, and that is the subtitle of this book, which is the global race to reinvent the state. We are seeing in the world at the moment, I think, a global race to reinvent the state. Business people will tell you that the worst sort of race to be in is one that you don't actually know that you're involved in. So Sears was destroyed by Walmart because it didn't know it was competing with Walmart. Walmart itself may be destroyed by Amazon because it doesn't know that it's competing with Amazon. And I think what's happening in the West at the moment is that we're actually competing with new state structures, new forms of state in Singapore, in China, in the other parts of the Far East, and we don't know that we're in a competition with them. We're not sufficiently aware that we're in a competition with them, and we need to be aware of that. So the state matters. The state is an important competitive resource. The state is something that can be reinvented and has been reinvented, and the state is something that's important to our global competitive future. The thesis of this book can be very simply stated, and that is over the past few centuries, since essentially the 16th century, we've seen 3.5 great revolutions in the state. The first revolution was a security revolution. The first revolution took place in the 16th and 17th centuries with the rise of the modern nation state. And the idea behind this was that there was a shortage in the supply of physical security, and that the state needed to step in to provide that sort of physical security. Europe was a place that was too dangerous. Europe was a place that was too unstable, and the state steps in to provide that crucial ingredient of law and order. And what we argue in this book is that the philosopher of this new security revolution is Thomas Hobbes. And the great work that he writes, which is about security, is called Leviathan. When Thomas Hobbes was born in 1588, Europe is really a blood-drenched backwater in the world. Anybody born in that era would probably think that the future belongs to Turkey or to India, or most importantly to China. In Europe, there are about 3 cities that have populations of more than 300,000 people, which are, I think, London, Paris, and Naples. In China, there are 300,000 people in the royal palace, in the forbidden city in Beijing. In just one part, in the royal apparatus, the imperial apparatus, there are 300,000 people, many of them civil servants chosen from the whole empire by a process of rigorous examinations, the best and brightest from this whole huge empire. So that's an extraordinary sophistication, extraordinary concentration of power and wisdom. The biggest collection of brains in the world applied to the process of ruling this great empire. In Europe at that time, life is, in Hobbes's phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. You have the 30 Years' War, which, as its name suggests, lasts for 30 years, kills a sixth of the population of Germany. You have revolutions right across Europe. You have religious wars, you have aristocratic wars, dynastic wars. Thomas Hobbes himself was born, he said, it was born in the middle of a violent storm, and his wife, his mother delivered him prematurely because she was too terrified, A, by the storm, and B, by the rumor that the Spanish had arrived. The Armada had landed and they were about to conquer England. And he said at the time, fear and I were born twins. And the great theme of Leviathan, the great theme of everything that Hobbes writes is fear. The world is dangerous, the world is disordered, the world is anarchic. We need to have this great Leviathan to protect us from ourselves, from our worst instincts, and from force. And we do, in Europe, create at that time a relatively stable political order. The sovereigns gain monopolies of power. They bring the aristocratic dynasties to heel. They get rid of religious wars by declaring cuius regio, ius religio. The monarch controls the religion of the people. Religious wars end, dynastic wars end, and you have a certain measure of peace. But at the same time, Europe manages to preserve a good degree of competition. China is peaceful. It's too peaceful. The whole empire is under the control of the emperor, and order is all enveloping. In Europe, we have competition between England and Spain, Spain and Portugal, Spain, France and Portugal. All of these countries are competing with each other, and they create a sort of dynamism that comes from competition that means when the Chinese invent gunpowder, they use it to entertain themselves, to create fireworks. When we enlightened Europeans invent gunpowder, we use it to blow each other up. When the Chinese see foreign trade, they see it as a threat. So they retreat from trade, they become protectionists, they look inwards. We see trade as a way of getting richer. Now, whatever's wrong with trade, whatever's wrong with using gunpowder to blow people up, that turns Europe into a huge center of power, of outward power. We begin to dominate the world because we have a magic sort of mixture between stability at home and competition which creates expansionism abroad. Which brings me to the second revolution. The second revolution is based on a very different theme, and that theme is not security, but liberty. The heart of this revolution is about providing individual freedom and restricting the power of the state and providing a measure of accountability. Now, there are many versions of this revolution. People quite often look to America and say the American Revolution was the first great liberal revolution of freedom. I think America was an irrelevant, peripheral country on the far edge of civilization. So we'll forget about them. Other people say the French Revolution was the first great liberal revolution, and the French are quite proud of what they did in their revolution. I say, well, that ended in bloodshed. It ended in disaster. It ended in Napoleon and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchs. So we'll forget about France. The real revolution, the real liberal revolution, the really exciting liberal revolution, I think, for us at the moment is what happened in Britain. Slightly nationalist turn there. What happened in Britain in the 19th century, the liberal revolution of the Victorians. Because what happened then is that we had a revolution based upon the notion of liberty, brilliantly articulated by the second of my two great thinkers, which is John Stuart Mill. Mill plays the same role that Hobbes played in the 17th century of articulating what this revolution is about, which is preserving liberty, preserving the freedom of the individual, and making the state more accountable. And what you see in mid-19th century Britain is something that's extraordinary, something that's remarkable, and that is the size of the state actually declines. You constrict the size of the state at the same time as providing better services. So taxation in Britain in 1816 is about £80 million. Taxation in Britain by 1846 is £60 million, at a time when the population has grown by 50%, at a time when you're creating schools, creating a national police force for the first time, creating a sewerage system, all sorts of public services. We use less money to provide more benefits. How do we do this? Partly we do it through Mr. Gladstone. He said that he was dedicated to the notion of cheese paring, saving candles. He used cheap writing paper. He saves all sorts of money. He hates extravagance. He goes round his civil servants and chides them if they're spending too much money on writing paper and things like that. That's one reason. But more importantly, what he does is to say that the state is doing all the wrong sorts of things. The state exists to provide jobs for civil servants, provide jobs for aristocrats, provide sinecures for rich people. It's essentially what they called in that period a system of old corruption, a system of outdoor relief for the upper classes. Lots of sinecures, lots of money going to people, lots of jobs that don't entail any responsibilities whatsoever. So what happens in the mid-19th century is a revolution in the concept of the state that says the state shouldn't be doing that much. It shouldn't be regulating the price of corn. It shouldn't be trying to intervene in the economy. But what it should do is to provide services for the people. So you select civil servants on merit. You sack them if they don't do their job properly. You keep them to their feet to the fire so they're performing quite well. So you replace a system in which the state exists to provide service, to provide money to the upper classes, old corruption, with a system in which the state exists to provide services for the people. By doing that, you restrict the size of the state and improve the quality of the state. An incredible revolution, a really important revolution. But things then begin to go slightly wrong, to become slightly questioned. There's a problem with the issue of compassion. Too many people are poor, too many people haven't got any resources, too many people aren't going to school. John Stuart Mill, the great prophet of this liberal revolution, begins to have second thoughts. He begins to think, well, perhaps the state ought to be a bit bigger. It ought to be providing services for people. It ought to be providing free school education. It ought to be providing old age pensions. We can't have poor people dying in the streets. So you get an argument from compassion. Dickens' wonderful Hard Times. All these books of these great Victorian writers talk about this case for compassion. But you also get, at the same time, a case for efficiency. Lots of people are beginning to say, well, the state needs to intervene because it's actually an agent of efficiency. It can make society more efficient. So you've got Bismarck in Germany inventing old age pensions, improving the quality of education, putting money into universities. And the British begin to think, well, actually, we're going to fall behind Germany because they've learned that public spending can actually be useful. And you get British imperialists saying, we can't run an A1 empire equipped with a C3 population. The population are too weak. The population are too malnourished. They're too badly fed. We have to have free school meals. We have to have free school milk. We have to be investing in the quality of the population. And so you're drifting towards the third revolution. And the third revolution is the notion that the basic function of the state must be to provide welfare for the population, must be to provide a basic minimum of pensions, a basic minimum of education, a basic minimum of sick pay for people who are sick, of unemployment pay for people who lose their jobs. And again, I think in this book, we say that there are certain symbolic intellectuals who help to explain what's going on. The people we pick on are Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the founders of the Fabian Society, the founders of the New Statesman, the founders of the London School of Economics. And what the Fabians basically say is that the state is an agency of national efficiency and an agency of national compassion. It can organize the world much better than the free market can ever organize the world. And that is an idea which takes hold round Britain and then around the rest of the world. And you have the state then basically taking on more responsibilities, assuming more and more functions, and becoming bigger and bigger. So the state jumps forward again in the 1930s with the Great Depression. The solution to the problem of the Great Depression is the Keynesian solution, spending more money. Then you have the Second World War, and after the Second World War, you have again the notion that the state must get bigger. You have the notion that we should build a new Jerusalem, give the people the rewards that they need for having fought in this war. That's what happened in Britain. The Labour Party came to power to deliver a new Jerusalem. We have much of Europe that's in devastation and chaos. So government spending is the best way of dealing with that problem, of building a new world. So you have that. And then in the 50s and 60s, there's a general drift towards bigger and bigger public spending. So you have it's not enough just for the state to have free secondary school education, you have to have free university education. It's not enough to have free university education, you have to have free postgraduate education. It's not enough just to have free medical care, you have to have free, super efficient, super technologically powered hospitals. It's not enough just to have free culture, you have to have free operas, you have to have free libraries. The state is offered more and more and more. And there's always an argument to give more to everybody. Because if you're going to give something, how can you stop? And so the state keeps getting bigger. And for a long while, that seems to go really well. The economy is booming, people are happy, people are getting benefits that they never had before, people whose parents left school at 14 are going to university. It seems to be a perfect equilibrium. But then, in the 1970s, things begin to go wrong once again. Spending doesn't seem to deliver the sort of benefits that you expected from the spending. You spend more and more government money, and instead of getting growth, you get inflation plus stagflation. You spend more on housing the poor, helping the poor, and instead of ending poverty, poverty is institutionalized. As Ronald Reagan said, we declared war on poverty, and poverty won. You have crime, an epidemic of crime getting bigger. You have all these awful sort of high-rise houses that people have built in this Corbusian notion of creating a sort of urban utopia. And in fact, they created an urban hell. And you have everything the state touches, it seems to fail at. Even the Vietnam War, you think you can fight this war against these people in Vietnam, hold back communism, win it, and in fact, you lose that war. So the state is thoroughly discredited. And that leads to a half revolution. We talk about 3.5 revolutions. What happens under Reagan and Thatcher, we call a half revolution. It's an incredibly important and dramatic set of changes under Reagan and Thatcher in many ways. The state had been running a lot of companies, a lot of industries. The state in Britain, America, and then in the 1990s in much of Europe gets out of the business of running industries. Business is set free from the power of the state. That's an important revolution. That's a big change. Up until Thatcher and Reagan, the answer to every question, every problem, had been basically we need to spend more money, more government money. After the Thatcher and Reagan revolution, that becomes a difficult answer to give to every question. There's also the alternative answer. Well, let's reduce the size of government. Let's let markets take over. So that's a half revolution, a revolution in our assumptions, a revolution in what the state thinks it should do. But nevertheless, the state continues to grow. It's in Britain. I remember the Thatcher era. It was an era of incredible turmoil, incredible anger, incredible division. And in that time, I think Mrs. Thatcher reduced spending on welfare from 22.8% of GDP to 22.2% of GDP. Not very much. Ronald Reagan, he cut taxes, but partly because the Democrats were in charge of Congress, he doesn't cut congressional spending, so spending continues to go up. And even after that, once you have the Thatcher and Reagan begin to disappear, after that, state public spending begins once again to resume growth. George W. Bush increases American public spending more than any president since LBJ. He even has this slogan of big government conservatism. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown come to power on the notion of keeping spending down, but then gradually spend more and more and more. And under Gordon Brown, it really gets out of control. So around the world, we have an expansion again of government spending, a continued increase of government regulation. So only a half revolution. I believe now that we're at the beginning of a fourth revolution, which will be just as dramatic as the first three that I've described, and much more dramatic than what happened in the 1980s under Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Why do I believe this, since so often people have talked about the beginning of a revolution in government, and so often they've been disappointed, so often things haven't changed? Partly for a negative reason. There was an American economist called Herb Stein who said, if something can't go on, it will stop. And I think that's true of what's happening with our public spending at the moment. The level of debt and deficit is too high. It's too dangerous to be floating in this sea of debt and deficit. Keynesian demand management was supposed to be a stimulus that you gave only at certain times when the economy needed it. It's become something that people have become addicted to constantly. And the result of it is that you don't get the kick out of it, you become completely addicted to it. So I think France has not balanced its budget since 1960. America has done it 3 times since 1960. Most countries are running permanent debt. And that is also happening at a time when demography is turning against the countries, the countries in the West. What we're seeing now is populations beginning to age, the baby boomers beginning to move towards retirement and senescence, costing more and more money, the ratio of people who are productive in the economy going down, the ratio of people who are dependent upon the productive going up, quite dramatically, beginning in Europe now, and beginning in America now, and also actually in China. And so we cannot continue to have the same laxness of state, so we're going to have to control our public spending for that reason. So that's the negative reason, but there's also a positive reason why I think we're at the beginning of a fourth revolution, and that is the reason of technology. I think that modern technology gives us the capacity to change the way that we deliver a great deal of what the state does. What happened in the 19th century is we had an industrial revolution, which meant that manufacturing things, making things, could be made dramatically more efficient. The whole material basis of civilization was changed by the 19th century industrial revolution. And what we're seeing now is a service sector revolution, an intellectual revolution, which is every bit as dramatic. Information technology can change the way we deliver all sorts of services, and these services happen to be concentrated in areas dominated by the state. So you have education, you have healthcare, you have the police and crime, you have the military. All of these either will be or are being revolutionized by this digital revolution. Look at crime. Levels of crime in the United States and in Europe are going down, sometimes quite dramatically. And they're going down essentially because it's harder to be a criminal. It's harder to steal a car. It's harder to rob a bank. It's harder to rob a house because we have alarms, we have sensors, we have all sorts of ways of tracking people. The police are equipped with all sorts of things which mean that they can deploy their forces, police forces, much more efficiently. This is a silent revolution that's been going on, an increase in the productivity of crime fighting. Look at education. We can now, through education, mean that a single great teacher can teach hundreds of people, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people over the internet, over the iPad. Something like the Khan Academy. The Khan Academy was created by somebody who wanted to help his nephews learn algebra, master a few basic facts of mathematics. Soon it went viral on the internet. Everybody was using it. And now this man, who is not even a professional trained teacher, has taught around the world millions of people. Bill Gates sends his own children to the Khan Academy on the internet to learn things. So you're seeing technology revolutionizing education. You're seeing exactly the same process happening in healthcare through the use of sensors which can monitor your health condition, monitor the health condition of people in hospitals. We're moving towards a world in which everybody's health will be constantly monitored. Everybody will know what your health status is like, so the likelihood that you will break down without knowing it goes down and down all the time. So every area that the state really focuses on is being dramatically changed. Productivity is dramatically improving. Even the most ancient of all functions of the state, the classic function of the state, which is to fight wars, that's becoming something that's not so labor intensive, is much more technologically enabled. Armies used to be big groups of people who had to be conscripted, had to be forced to fight, and you won the army if you had the most people, basically. Now it's about having much smaller divisions of people, having technologically enabled people, having much better equipped people, and also increasingly it's about using robots and it's about using drones. It's about using technology. So the American army uses a lot of drones. Obviously, it now employs 15,000 robots. And we're at the very beginning of this technological revolution. very, very close to the beginning. In 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time, healthcare, education, policing, crime fighting will all be completely different if we allow it to be. So we can actually have a productivity revolution in the state, which will be extraordinary, I think. So we are living through this revolution, and it's a revolution that's being driven by necessity. It's a revolution that's being driven by opportunity, but it's also a revolution that's been driven by a final thing, and that's something that I haven't talked about very much yet, but I will, and that's competition. From the 16th century onwards, there was only one game in town, and that was the West. The West invented the state, the West reinvented the state, the West dominated state building. So China in the 16th century is the dominant power. It has this powerful state, and it fails to keep its state reinvented. It fails to keep it up to date, so it falls behind. What's happening now is in the East, you're getting people who are actually beginning to invent and improve, invent new forms of state, and are beginning to compete with the West in terms of the quality and efficiency of their state. Singapore is the paradigmatic example of this. It has a significantly smaller state than the West, than any Western country, provides better education, better healthcare, better old age pensions. It provides essentially a very frugal but very efficient state. China is beginning to build a very powerful state. I know that there's lots of bad news about China at the moment. I know that there are figures saying that China's growth rate is declining, that China's reputation for inviolability has taken a bit of a battering because they mishandled their stock market crisis. All of that is true, but I think we've been very, very foolish to underestimate what's happened in China. That they have gone in the 1980s to about 3% of global GDP, to about 25% now. They've built a world-class university system out of nothing. They've created a world-class social security system, not a world-class, but a rudimentary social security system out of nothing. They've got some of the world's best airports, the world's best roads. They have built a modern state. And they've done this on a set of assumptions which are completely different from liberal democracy. Their notion is authoritarian, Mandarin, top-down. They say liberalism is wrong, democracy is wrong. We can beat you at the state-building game by having a different set of assumptions. So for the first time since the 16th century, we have a new competitor with a new set of values, which is challenging the dominant notion in the West. And their notion is that authoritarian, Mandarin, top-down modernization is the way to go. Now, I don't think it is the way to go, but I think that it's a real and significant challenge. And if you go around the world, if you go to emerging market countries, what they will quite often say to you is, why should we listen to the West talk about democracy? Why should we listen to the West talk about liberty when China's better at running its country? China can provide airports, roads, all the infrastructure and equipment that business needs and that people need to be prosperous. America cannot balance its budget. America is constantly shutting down its government, as it's about to do next week. The Congress is unpopular. The system is divided. It's gridlocked. It's got Donald Trump. It's a total mess. And why should we listen to you people in Europe when you've created this European currency, which has precipitated a massive crisis, when you have this refugee crisis, you're closing your borders, you're opening your borders, you don't know what you're doing. Europe is based on the free movement of people. That's been terminated quite often. Europe is based on this common, wonderful currency. Well, actually, that's led to stagnation and crisis. Europe is based on this idea of democracy. Well, you keep sacking prime ministers, you sack people who take power in Greece, you sack the Italian prime minister. You're not obeying your own rules. So you quite often hear people saying, actually, democracy isn't doing that well, and authoritarian modernization is doing much better. And I say to that what you need to do is to reform democracy, to regalvanize democracy in order to save it. What we need to do with democracy is to slim government, is to stop it making so many promises, to stop it being so dysfunctional, to make it live, cut its cloth according to its means. I think we need to have a much more rigorous set of rules about pension funding, because at the moment what we're doing basically is robbing future generations in order to pay current generations. We need to have a much more rigorous set of rules about economic management, because we have a very volatile system of economic management at the moment. We need to centralize many decisions. On the other hand, I think we need, at the same time, to counterbalance that, to devolve a lot of decisions down to lower levels of decision making. I'm speaking particularly about Britain, which has a very over-concentrated central government. So we need to understand that it's not enough to say democracy is wonderful, liberalism is wonderful. We have to understand that at the moment we have a system that's not delivering, that's promising too much, that is disappointing too many people, that's creating a frenzy of dislike and opposition, that is creating populist revolts. And in order to save it, we need to make it a little bit slimmer, a little bit more efficient, and above all, harness the power of modern technology to deliver public services a lot better than we have in the last few years. Thank you.